really pleased to be here, despite the vile weather. I was hoping to have a wander around Shrewsbury, but I don't think I'm going to today, if you don't mind. First of all, I wanted to say an absolutely enormous thank you to every single one of you, and to the branch officers, and Rick in particular, because I've been trying to keep up with the havoc that your very own Barrow boy has been wreaking. And it's obviously horrendous. Whether or not it's all necessary, inverted commas, whether or not the level of your funding requires the havoc that's being wreaked to be wreaked, I don't know, but I suspect not. And there are obviously all kinds of dodgy dealings going on around his company and everything else. But I wanted to thank you for being members of the union, but also growing the union, as I know has happened and as I've heard today, in what is a really difficult time when, although we're doing incredibly well as a union in terms of our membership, it's beginning to dip, and particularly in local government, and not surprisingly given the 500,000 jobs that have gone since the coalition came in, and we lost 2% of our income over the last year, and 2% we can kind of live with, but if that continues, 2% every year for a few years, and we're going to have to begin to look very carefully at what we do and how we do it. Might not be a bad thing, but and so far we've managed to avoid redundancies, but there could well be redundancies in the offing. So you have done an utterly fantastic job in bucking the trend, not just in terms of keeping membership up, but also, I think, doing what Unison has to do, being the voice of local public services and engaging with users and your local community over what's happening and fighting to defend those services. Because if we as Unison don't do it, then I really don't know who will. We are the largest public service union, still with over 1 million members and all our families and friends. So we have got to be and continue to be the voice of public services. And in general, apart from the 500,000 jobs that have gone, as you will all know from your own bank accounts, pay has declined by about 18% since the coalition came in. That's just basic pay, and that's without all of those local cuts to unsocial hours payments, the freeze on car allowances, annual leave, increasingly sick pay, and so on. And so we know that you're really up against it. So keeping the union going alongside your own personal struggle is an amazing achievement. I wanted to say a bit about the coalition, in the sense that it's very easy, I think, to be very downhearted and not to be able to see any hope for the future. But the coalition's hugely ideological assault on the public sector, not required as a result of Labour's profligacy, is clearly failing in its own terms. The deficit that they wanted to reduce, they've only managed to reduce by 1/3. They've borrowed 602 billion compared to the 322 billion they said they were going to borrow. And on every measure, what the coalition is doing is actually failing. And of course it's bound to fail with unemployment growing, people's incomes going down and so on. So take by the Treasury is reduced. And even the Mervyn King, who was Governor of the Bank of England, said it was the fault of the financial sector not spending on public services. And I'm sure you know all that. And of course we're also becoming a much more unequal society. So in 1975, the top rate of taxation was 83%. And with all the fuss there's been about Labour's proposal for 50%, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? 83% at the top and 45% at the bottom. and 45% in 2014. And now it's 30% at the top and 20% at the bottom. And also with increased VAT and all kinds of other indirect taxation. So inequality, just if you look at taxation, has clearly grown. And the so-called recovery that we're being told is happening is clearly not happening for many, many people, including local government workers. A recent poll by Ipsos Mori showed that 62% of people polled don't believe that they are benefiting from the recovery, and that they're not likely to in the future. And it's not really a true economic recovery because we still have a very unbalanced economy. Manufacturing is still incredibly weak, exports are very weak. And I happen to be a member of the Low Pay Commission for my sins until later this year, as well as being responsible for local government negotiations. And one of the very interesting things I learned at our Low Pay Commission meeting last week was that £8 billion of the recovery driven by consumptions, all those cars that people are buying and so on, is actually has come from PPI repayments. And people are treating PPI compensation as kind of a windfall, which most people didn't expect to get, did they? And they're spending it on consumer goods. So there is an inflated recovery as a consequence of that, which is really interesting, I think. I wanted to say a bit about, obviously, Unison and how we respond to the crisis. And I know and I understand that there is a feeling out there that Unison has been saying a lot about the NHS and not so much about local government. And I wanted to say what I'm hoping we're going to be doing, starting kind of quite soon. But I also wanted to try and explain a bit why that happens. First of all, the NHS, as you know, is a national service that's very sexy, and health is very integral to everyone's lives. It's also it is a national service, and it's very much easier for us to get press coverage around the NHS than it is local government. So we have a constant stream of press releases and stuff going out on local government cuts and pay. Very, very difficult to get the press and media to pick them up. 5 years ago, when we lodged, for instance, the local government pay claim, immediately there would be the BBC, Sky News. They'd all want to talk to someone about it. They'd all want to know what we wanted. They'd all want to know if we were going on strike. Now, there are, first of all, very few industrial correspondents. So the BBC doesn't have an industrial correspondent. They used to have a great bloke called Stephen Cape who loved us, and he'd always want to know what we were doing. There is no industrial correspondent. And because of the fragmented nature of local government, it's actually very, very difficult to get press and media interested in what we're doing, which isn't, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I just wanted to explain that to you because enormous effort goes into trying to keep a high profile on what's happening to you on a daily basis, but it is quite difficult. I mean, so far, since the coalition came in my very small team that not only deals with local government, we deal with the Food Standards Agency, the Care Quality Commission, police support staff, probation, CAFCAS, you name it, we do it. We focused our attention on trying to support branches and regions through kind of capacity building and providing information and analysis around, for instance, local government finance. So I've got someone in my team called Pete Chalice who's been a councillor, understands local government finance, and I know he's helped your branch unpick what's happening to your finances. We produce the cuts pack and a redundancy pack for you all to use. We're producing a series of reports called the damage reports. You may have seen the one on trading standards and environmental health officers and libraries. We've got one coming up on women and the cuts. We've got one coming up on the cuts to youth services. And slowly we're beginning to develop quite a profile around some of those things. But we recognise that we need to do more to big up, first of all, to big up what's happening in local government so that the public understand it more and so that we can try and grab more headlines. We want to give more support to regions and branches. We want to make a bigger political impact. And when I talk about that, I mean we want to make an impact in the local elections this year, very important local elections. We clearly need to make an impact in the general election. As Carolyn said earlier, at the moment there's absolutely no certainty at all that we will do away with the coalition. And we absolutely have to. If we want to retain our public services. But we are particularly working on trying to influence the shadow cabinet. At the moment, there's some signs that Labour is beginning to move away from this idea that they stick to coalition spending limits. They're not moving away from the 1% public sector pay limit. Certainly talking about increased capital, if not revenue expenditure. As you will know, Ed Miliband has been bigging up the living wage and so on. And there are some signs that, there's a real rethink, and certainly local government being brought more centrally, I think, into Labour's thinking. But we've got a hell of a long way to go, I think, to convince Labour that privatisation still is not an answer to everything, when we know at the moment actually privatisation of public services is one of the reasons why many local authorities are struggling, because they're having to pay hugely inflated interest on PFIs and externalised contracts, many of which are very inflexible, and councils are finding it very difficult to rewire or adapt public services, local public services, to the new financial environment because of outsourcing. And we're beginning to see a steady trickle of insourcing, as well as a continuation, unfortunately, of big outsourcings. So we're launching a new big cuts campaign around local government. Struggled to find a title, very difficult. It's going to be SOS, local government, save our services. There'll be a lot of social media and so on attached to it. Our objective is to make popular, inverted commas, to make easy to understand what's happening to finances. I'm going to ask Caroline if I can pinch 2 of her slides afterwards. We're going to really be, as I say, making a big attempt to work with the shadow cabinet. And I had some discussions with Brian Strutton, my GMB equivalent, with the leader of the Labour group on the LGA and the chair of the Workforce Board a couple of weeks ago about working more closely together around all of these things. But I wanted to say something more about pay. We've got 500,000 people in local government earning less than the living wage. We've now got 103 councils paying the living wage, but many of those have introduced it in exchange for cuts to other conditions. Some haven't introduced the national living wage. And in my view, and as our claim this year shows, we clearly believe that no one should earn less than the living wage. It's not a fortune. It assumes that people have access to social housing and that they have cars, which many of our members don't. But introducing it at a local level is also causing real complications in terms of pay and grading structures and equal pay proof pay systems. Something we've got to be very careful about. And that's why we lodged the claim we've lodged this year, which actually now is for £1.20 an hour. because the living wage went up from £7.45 to £7.65. And what we're saying is that everybody should get that. Everybody's had an 18% cut in pay. We want the living wage at the bottom, and we want people above that level to be compensated for the drop in basic pay, not to mention all those other cuts. We had some very interesting research done for us by a small think tank that we use quite often called the New Policy Institute. Some of you may have seen it, we circulated it, which showed that actually if our claim were met, 55% of the cost would be recouped by the Treasury through increased take in tax, national insurance and indirect taxation like VAT through increased spending. Clearly that would be money going to the Treasury. But I wrote to George Osborne and said, look, this is our research, this is what it says, what's stopping you recycling that money? I had an email back from a civil servant saying it wasn't anything to do with him and she'd sent it to DCLG, so don't hold your breath. But we believe that we live in the 7th richest country in the world. We believe as Unison that there is an alternative to what's going on. We know that local government is the worst paid part of the public sector by a very long way. The only other bit of the public sector where the living wage is not the bottom rate is health, and they only have about 20,000 people below the living wage. And it looks like the Department of Health is going to deal with that in the next pay round. Everyone else starts at a higher rate. In our view, we believe that probably rewiring public services, community budgeting, local authorities leading joined-up public services at a local level is the way to go. But if it is the way to go, then something very drastic will have to be done about local government pay and conditions. And that's also true, of course, when we get more health and social care integration, because we're going to be having some very interesting equal pay situations, I think, apart from anything else, when there's more joint working of that kind. So we have an economic alternative as a union which says that actually what we want, decent pay, decent conditions and retention of public sector jobs is quite possible. If, for instance, all the tax that isn't collected were collected, then we would have £32 billion simply from the tax that HMRC doesn't get round to collecting. We'd have 90 billion if somebody dared tackle tax evasion. So that's what 122 billion. And then if we had the financial transactions tax, what I like to call the Maid Marian tax, and most people call the Robin Hood tax, we'd have another 23 billion. So simply by dealing with taxation, and I know it's not quite that simple, a huge part of the problem would be solved. We know that every redundancy that's made in the public sector costs nearly £24,000 in benefits, in recruitment elsewhere. It's an absolute false economy, and we know that the level of social need is nowhere, by no means being met by any local authority or within the NHS or elsewhere. But I do think it's really important that we as Unison, and this is one of the other things that we're really doing at the moment, that we as Unison don't just revert to saying, well, we just want the money put back. We just need the cuts restored. We just need the level of funding kept at a decent level, because I don't think that is enough. We do have a changing society. The demographics are changing. As Caroline talked about earlier, as you all know, an ageing population, but also a growth in young people. People's needs are changing, And I absolutely agree with the point Carolyn made about prevention rather than crisis intervention. I think as a union, we have a real duty and a real place in engaging in a dialogue with the LGA, but with Labour, and it would be nice to think other political parties too, about what we want from public services, what public services our society needs and deserves, and work back from there. And I do think that putting more money into prevention, and I think public health coming into local government is a really welcome move from that point of view, is a very, very important starting point. And I think you are the people who have to be absolutely central to that discussion. And it's one of the things that we're constantly saying to shadow cabinet people. And Ed Miliband's views about public service reform, a bit disappointing, I think, because I think you are the people with the knowledge and the expertise, and your knowledge and expertise needs to be fed in through your own councils, but needs to be part of a new partnership in the future that is about really rethinking the kind of local public services that we want. And I think as a union, we should always, always, always be arguing for the best possible use of public money. I think we should be on the side of efficiency. I don't think there's anything wrong with efficiency, but it should be from what I think could be some very interesting kind of local audits of social need. And we're working on a kind of model that maybe branches can think about to look more closely at the needs of your local communities. So I think there are some enormous challenges for us. First of all, keeping our union together. We're doing well, and you're doing particularly well. But as I say, we're only 2 or 3 years off there being a crisis if we don't maintain and grow our membership. And there are huge, huge areas of possible expansion of our membership. Our density is still only about 50% in local government. And we know that we haven't followed huge swathes of workers like home carers, for instance, who really are up against it in terms of paying conditions, into the private sector. So I know that branches are under huge pressures too, and stewards are having to do more than ever. And sometimes the idea of having more members is not a particularly welcome one. But as a union, I'm certainly arguing within our senior managers group that we have to do something very drastic about that. So we've got to keep our union together, but at the same time, we've got to do some very sharp thinking about what we want from local government, what we want from the NHS and all the other public services that we cover. And we cover most apart from the civil service and teaching. And we've even got more members now moving into civil service areas. So I'm going to end again just by saying thank you for what you're doing, but don't just think about fighting against what's happening. Think about where you think local public services should go, and indeed where the union should go, because there's always room for us as a union to improve as well.